Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Oakville Blobs. In the summer of 1994, the quiet rural town of Oakville, Washington, experienced a weather event unlike any other, one that would become a local legend and a scientific mystery. Nestled in Grays Harbor County, with a population of only a few hundred at the time, Oakville was accustomed to the rhythms of the Pacific Northwest weather. Rain was an almost everyday occurrence, with drizzles and downpours gracing the town roughly 275 days out of the year. Normally, these rains were unremarkable, nourishing the dense forests and dampening the fertile farmland surrounding the community. Life moved at an unhurried pace. Neighbors all knew each other, and nothing much out of the ordinary ever happened in Oakville. That sense of normalcy was gently upended on an early August morning in a place nicknamed Timbertown, USA, known historically for its logging and farming. No one expected the rain itself to become front-page news, but on August 7th, 1994, as soft gray clouds gathered over Oakville, something extraordinary began to fall from the pre-dawn sky. Instead of the usual clear raindrops pattering on rooftops and fields, residents would awaken to find their town dappled with tiny gelatinous blobs, a mysterious substance that has since defied definitive explanation. This event, later dubbed the Oakville Blobs incident, marked the beginning of a puzzle that scientists, officials, and townfolk have contemplated for decades. In the chapters that follow, we recount this strange occurrence in a calm and factual narrative, piecing together eyewitness accounts, medical records, laboratory analyses, and theories that have emerged over the years. We will journey through Oakville's initial shock and curiosity, the unfolding series of blob falls, the community's reaction, the health effects on people and animals, and the numerous attempts to analyze and explain the phenomenon. The tone throughout remains gentle and even-keeled, much like the resilience of the community of Oakville, aiming to explore the facts without sensationalism. By the end, we'll also touch on later incidents, including a strikingly similar episode in 2025, and reflect on the lasting legacy of the Oakville Blobs. Through it all, the story serves as a reminder of how even in our modern, well-understood world, nature, or perhaps human technology, can still surprise us with puzzles that invite wonder and careful investigation. Initial discovery. In the very early hours of August 7th, 1994, a light rain began to fall over Oakville. At around 3 a.m., police officer David Lacey was on patrol, driving the dark, empty back roads of the town. Lacey was no stranger to heavy rain obscuring his windshield. It was a routine part of life in Oakville, but this time, the rain behaved strangely. As he flicked on his windshield wipers, the usual clear swish of water was replaced by a smearing effect. The glass became smeared with a goopy film as though someone had smeared petroleum jelly across it, Startled, Lacey pulled his cruiser into a gas station's lot and stepped out to inspect what was covering the windshield. Under the glow of his headlights, he could see translucent, gelatinous blobs clinging to the glass. Each was tiny, later described as about the size of a grain of rice, or half that, and they had the consistency of jiggly jello. They were clear or milky in color and had no discernible odor, essentially like rain droplets turned to gel. Lacey put on a pair of latex gloves before touching the strange substance. Pressing it between his fingers, he found it to be mushy and squishy with a slimy texture that could be easily crushed. Nothing in his training as a police officer had prepared him for this odd rain. Standing in the quiet night, listening to the drip of gooey rain off the leaves, Lacey later recalls thinking, gee, this isn't right. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Where did this come from? He shared a look of bafflement with his ride-along friend and realized they were experiencing something highly unusual. The gentle patter of rain had become a shower of gelatinous blobs, and as the storm continued, these tiny globs blanketed the area. Lacey's intuition told him that something abnormal was happening, a feeling echoed by others who would soon encounter the blobs. Daybreak revealed the full extent of the phenomenon. As morning light spread over Oakville, residents woke to a scene that was both mundane and otherworldly. Superficially, it looked as if heavy rain had fallen. The town's streets, rooftops, and fields were wet as usual. But those who stepped outside or peered closely noticed an uncanny difference. Every surface was littered with small gelatinous particles. One resident later described seeing her yard covered in the tiny blobs, each one a translucent jelly-like droplets scattered across the ground. Longtime Oakville local Dottie Hearn recalled peering out at her farm's property and seeing what looked like white hailstones sprinkled everywhere, on the wooden pump house, on the grass, on the soil. Yet, the weather had been too mild for hail, and when she investigated up close, Dottie realized these were not ice pellets at all, but squishy globs of clear gelatin. They were so lightweight that they had splattered and spread thin in places, creating a slimy film on surfaces. Dottie's daughter, Sunny Barcliff, noted the blobs dotted atop a black asphalt roof on their 29-acre farm, making them stand out visibly. It was as if the night had strewn dollops of jelly all across their property. Other early risers around Oakville encountered the same puzzling sight. Some found the goo on their cars and doorknobs. Others saw it clinging to plants and fences. Curiosity naturally took hold. Neighbors phoned each other or met in person to compare observations. It seemed the entire town and surrounding area, later estimated at up to a 20-square-mile radius, had been affected. Those who touched the blobs found them tacky and gelatinous with no smell, apart from a faint, clean scent of rainwater. When pressed, the blobs would disintegrate, smearing into a watery, mucus-like consistency. They were certainly not any form of typical precipitation that locals knew. Initial speculations ran wild in a lighthearted way. Could this be some kind of strange animal spawn? Or an algae from the river? Maybe scraps of jellyfish? Or even a bizarre prank? In these first hours, the mood was more bemused than panicked. Oakville residents, practical and accustomed to natural curiosities, approached the blobs with cautious fascination. Officer Lacey, having completed his night shift, was not alone in witnessing the blobs fall from the sky. A handful of other people awake during the pre dawn hours reported actually seeing the gelatinous rain in action. They described water droplets that were not water at all, but had a jelly like consistency as they hit surfaces. Most town folks, however, only discovered the blobs after the fact at sunrise. As the morning went on, word of the odd rain quickly spread. By midday on August 7th, nearly everyone in Oakville knew that something peculiar had happened the night before. Farmers, shop owners, the postmaster, children on summer break, all found themselves talking about the same strange goo that seemed to have fallen from the clouds overnight. Thus, the Oakville Blobs made their quiet debut. The community was intrigued and a bit mystified, but few were alarmed at first. People had seen jelly-like substance in nature before. Sometimes slime molds or frog eggs can appear on the ground after rains. Perhaps this was something similar, they thought. To many, it was just another quirky story to swap over coffee. Did you see those weird jelly raindrops? What on earth could they be? Little did they know that this was only the beginning, and that the blobs would return repeatedly in the days ahead, turning the simple curiosity into a sustained mystery with serious implications. Unfolding events. After the initial downpour of blobs on August 7th, the bizarre phenomenon did not end. Over the next 3 weeks, 5 more episodes of the gelatinous rain were reported in the Oakville area. The mysterious blobs seemed to fall intermittently, sometime during passing rain showers, and sometimes even from seemingly cloudy but dry skies, according to some accounts. Each occurrence added a new layer to the mystery and expanded the affected zone. Ultimately, the gooey blobs were observed across roughly 20 square miles of the surrounding countryside, suggesting that whatever caused them was not confined to a single backyard or a prankster's bucket, but rather something dispersed widely in the atmosphere. Residents soon learned to recognize the peculiar sight. In subsequent blob falls, people reported seeing a fine, almost translucent drizzle that left tiny gelatinous grain on everything it touched. The blobs in the 1994 events were consistently described as minuscule, about the size of a grain of rice or even smaller. They were clear or milky white and soft to the touch, blending in with rainwater, but distinguishable upon close inspection by their jelly-like clumping. These later events often occurred during early morning hours as well, sometimes coinciding with light rain. For example, one later incident happened while Seattle journalist Tom Paulson was actually in Oakville covering the story. Paulson had driven down to the town during that August after hearing about the first blobs, initially expecting to write a quirky one-off news piece on a slow summer news day. As he sat interviewing 2 residents in their home about the prior blob shower, a rain began outside. To everyone's astonishment, it was blob rain again. Paulson found himself witnessing firsthand the very subject of his story as fresh gelatinous droplets splattered on the ground in the house's windows. I saw the blobs, he later affirmed emphatically, an event that turned a once light-hearted assignment into a personal encounter with the unknown. His windshield, like Officer Lacey's, was smeared with the goo. This serendipitous timing convinced Paulson and others that the earlier reports had been accurate. The sky was indeed periodically raining something unusual on Oakville. With each new shower of blobs, The local response evolved from curiosity toward concern. By the second or third occurrence, many Oakville residents were wary of touching the strange gelatin. The initial playfulness, come look at this weird jelly, began to give way to caution as some people suspected the blobs might be making them sick. Children were discouraged from playing in the puddles, and adults who ventured out often wore gloves or avoided direct contact with the goo. It was an eerie situation, rain that one could see and feel, yet which was not water. Many described looking up during later incidents and seeing nothing obvious, no odd color in the clouds, no aircraft overhead, just normal looking drizzle that left behind unwelcome deposits of slime. Community members took initiative in trying to figure out the mystery. A few gathered samples of the blob in jars or plastic bags to keep for observation and potential testing. Sonny Barcliffe, concerned by her mother Dottie's exposure to the substance, collected some of the gelatinous material from her farm and stored it in a small container. Others did the same, refrigerating the samples in hopes of preserving them. The blobs, however, did not hold up well over time. Many samples reportedly dissolved or evaporated after a day or two, turning into an odorless, evaporative residue. This transient nature, a tendency to melt or dry up, made the substance even harder to analyze, as the window for examination was short. As the events continued with no immediate explanation, Oakville residents increasingly sought help from outside. Phone calls were made to county health officials and the Washington state authorities. Local officials, including perhaps the Gray Harbor County Health Department, were informed that something had fallen from the sky multiple times and that people were uneasy about it. Eventually, samples of the blobs were delivered to Washington State's Department of Ecology and Department of Health for scientific analysis. The Department of Ecology's Hazardous Material Unit, in particular, received a sample, reportedly one from Sonny Barcliffe, to determine if the substance was an environmental hazard. Meanwhile, other locals with connection in labs, for instance, a hospital lab technician who was a friend of one family, took initiative to look at the blobs under a microscope. The stage was set for a deeper investigation, even as the blobs themselves kept falling without warning. During this period, the small Oakville community pulled together in the face of the unknown. Neighbors checked on one another, especially on those who had fallen ill. Conversations at the grocery store or gas station inevitably drifted to the same topic, the blobs. Some residents began to feel uneasy about going out in the rain, not knowing if another gelatinous shower might occur. A kind of local lore was forming in real time, as one longtime resident, Beverly Roberts, later recounted. Everybody in the whole town came down with something like the flu, only it was a really hard flu that lasted from 7 weeks to 2 or 3 months. This may have been a bit of an exaggeration born from hindsight, but it reflected the pervasive sense that whatever plague had arrived with the blobs, it had touched a lot of lives in Oakville. Despite the growing concern, there was also a strand of resilience and even humor in the community's response. Northwesterners are used to odd weather, and some people cope by making light of the situation. Local wags joked about needing umbrellas not just for rain, but for falling jelly. After the blobs had fallen a few times, imaginative ideas were floated. Perhaps Oakville could turn this into a quirky claim to fame. There was banter about starting a jellyfish festival in town where Tongue-in-cheek, Jellyfish would be shot out of a canyon to recreate the blob rain. A jovial reference to one of the wilder theories, the town tavern even toyed with inventing a new cocktail dubbed the Jellyfish, mixing vodka with gelatin and juice. These lighthearted responses indicated that, alongside genuine worry, many Oakville residents preferred to stay positive and not succumb to panic. They hoped an innocent explanation would emerge soon. Through mid to late August 1994, the gelatinous rain eventually ceased as mysteriously as they began. After 6 known incidents in about 3 weeks, no further blobs were reported in Oakville that year. By early September, the skies were back to delivering plain old rain, but the aftermath of those unusual weeks left the town with pressing questions. What were those blobs? Where did they come from? And why did people and animals exposed to them get sick? The community eagerly awaited answers from the officials and scientists examining the samples. The next part of our narrative turned to those health effects and the analyses that followed, which together paint a picture of a mystery that deepened before it could be solved. Public and official response. When the news of Oakville's strange rainfall began to spread beyond the town's borders, it caught the attention of local media and state authorities, prompting a mix of public curiosity and official action. Public response in Oakville itself was initially one of subdued fascination. Neighbors swapped stories about the blobs, and local newspapers from nearby towns started to pick up the story. The broader public in Washington state and beyond soon learned of Oakville's gooey rain through press coverage. What started as a small-town oddity quickly escalated into a topic of national interest, partly because it was so unusual, and partly because of the health scare associated with it. Within weeks, the Oakville Blobs were being discussed on radio shows and reported in major newspapers as a modern unsolved mystery. The incidents even made national headlines. For example, a short piece ran in the New York Times around August 20th, 1994, highlighting the weird precipitation and confirming that tests showed the blobs were of biological origin. They were once alive, according to one article. This kind of prominent coverage was remarkable for a tiny community like Oakville. Inside Oakville, as the community sought answers, there was outreach to various official agencies. Early on, some residents, or perhaps local law enforcement, wondered if the blobs could be some kind of waste dropped from an airplane. Oakville lies not terribly far from the flight path of commercial airliners and is also near military training areas. To investigate this possibility, Officer David Lacey and reporter Tom Paulson both made inquiries. Paulson, upon witnessing the blobs himself, recalls calling both the Federal Aviation Administration and the nearby McCord Air Force Base. He asked if any aircraft, civilian or military, had released any substance or if they had an explanation for gelatinous material falling from the sky. Both the FAA and the military base firmly denied any knowledge or involvement. The FAA noted that regulated aircraft waste from passenger plane lavatories, for instance, is dyed blue with chemicals, something known colloquially as blue ice when it accidentally falls, and thus clear blobs could not be from airplane toilets. McCord AFB likewise stated that nothing they were doing would result in jelly-like fallout over Oakville, pointing out that no routine operations matched the timing and location. though they later acknowledged some bombing exercises were happening over the Pacific Ocean, about 40 to 50 miles away during that period. In short, all official channels initially shrugged. There were no immediate explanation from the skies. As scientific interest grew, Washington State's Department of Health and Department of Ecology both became actively involved. Local residents and perhaps county health officials provided these departments with samples of the blobs for analysis. The Department of Ecology, responsible for environmental quality, treated it as a possible hazardous spill or environmental contaminant. The Department of Health looked at it from a public health angle, especially because people were reporting illnesses. An early official response was to test whether the substance was organic or inorganic. Intriguingly, the two agencies came back with conflicting results. According to journalist Tom Paulson, the Department of Ecology's tests indicated the blobs were inorganic, suggesting a chemical or non-living substance, whereas the Department of Health's test indicated an organic nature, suggesting a biological origin. This contradiction was perplexing. It meant that even within government analyses, there was no consensus on what the blob fundamentally were. As Paulson quipped, the testing resolved nothing. The public health officials faced mounting questions from residents. Should we be worried? Is the water or soil contaminated? Without clear answers, there was little direct advice they could give, beyond the standard caution to avoid touching the unknown substances. There was no formal evacuations or quarantine. The situation never escalated to that point. But informally, people were advised to wash their hands if they had handled the blobs and to seek medical care if they felt ill. Advice that in practice, many in Oakville were already following. Rumors and conspiracy-tinged theories naturally started bubbling up in the absence of an official explanation. Some Oakville locals began to suspect that the government knew more than it was saying. There were anecdotal reports, never officially confirmed, that in the days following the blob rain, a few unfamiliar, well-dressed men showed up around town, asking quiet questions at the diner or the tavern. These men were presumed to be government investigators, perhaps from some environmental agency or even the military. In their discreet presence fueled suspicion that something was being hidden. Strange men in suits, frequenting local establishments, became part of the lore. Although no one could say for sure who they were or what they concluded, Oakville's more distrustful residents interpreted the vanishing of blob samples, which we will talk about later, in these shadowy visits as signs of a cover-up. The idea took hold that maybe Oakville had been an unwitting test site for a secret experiment, and now officials were trying to quietly clean it up, an idea that, while unproven, would become one of the enduring narratives around the Oakville Blobs. The media's role in the public response was significant. After initial coverage by regional newspapers, the Oakville incident gained wider fame when it was featured on the television program Unsolved Mysteries. In 1997, the popular show aired a segment on the Oakville Blobs, bring the mystery into millions of living rooms across America. The host, Robert Stack, introduced it with dramatic flair, describing how on that August morning, it wasn't raining rain. It was raining tiny blobs of gelatinous goo, blanketing 20 square miles and brought with it something of a plague. Interviews with Oakville residents like Beverly Roberts and Officer Lacey were broadcast, lending first-hand credibility to the story and vividly conveying the town's experience. The Unsolved Mysteries episode portrayed the community as puzzled and afflicted, and openly asked whether this was the result of some military experiment. This national exposure turned the Oakville Blobs into a kind of modern legend, sparking public imagination well beyond Washington state. Calls and letters poured into officials and news outlets, with people offering their own theories or claiming similar experiences elsewhere. On the official front, the military eventually addressed one particular theory that was making the rounds: the idea that the Air Force inadvertently caused the blob by bombing jellyfish in the ocean. The U.S. Air Force did confirm that in the summer of 1994, the 354th Fighter Squadron had been conducting practice bombing runs over the Pacific, but they clarified that these operations were taking place far from Oakville, about 40 to 50 miles offshore, in weeks prior to the incident. They deemed it highly unlikely that fragments of any marine life could travel that distance then fall concentrated over Oakville. Furthermore, there was no evidence on radar or from weather patterns to support such a transfer. By addressing this theory publicly, the military attempted to quell speculation that it was responsible, directly or indirectly, for the blobs. However, their statements did not explain what did cause the blobs, leaving the core mystery intact. As days turned to weeks, the official stance on the Oakville Blobs solidified into an uncomfortable conclusion. No definitive cause could be determined. The Department of Ecology and Department of Health had no further leads after their initial tests. No government agency stepped up to declare case solved. In fact, as was quietly acknowledged later, the Washington Department of Health apparently did not retain any written records or samples related to the Oakville incident, or at least none that they were willing to confirm. This might have been due to the inconclusive nature of the findings, or possibly because the incident was considered low priority once immediate hazard seemed unlikely. To the town people, though, it felt as if the incident had been noted, then essentially dropped by authorities, adding to feelings of frustration. As one DOH microbiologist involved, Mike McDowell, later suggests, his superiors seemed oddly uninterested in following up. In summary, the public and official response to the Oakville Blobs was a mix of earnest investigation, denial of responsibility by authorities, and the growth of rumor in the information gaps. Oakville's residents were left in a kind of limbo. Their town had been the stage for an inexplicable event. Their health had been impacted, and yet officials could not tell them why or whether it would happen again. It's against this backdrop of uncertainty that we now examine the medical effects of the blob, the illnesses and health scares that elevated the blobs from mere curiosity to a matter of genuine alarm. Medical effects. Almost as soon as the first blobs touched the ground in Oakville, people began to report unusual health symptoms. What started as a peculiar weather event soon also felt like the onset of a mini epidemic. The connection between the gelatinous blob and illness was not scientifically proven, but in the minds of many Oakville residents, the timing was too coincidental to ignore. Dozens of previously healthy individuals suddenly came down with severe flu-like illnesses in the aftermath of the blob rain, and several animals fell ill or died. The town's experience thus straddled two mysteries: the origin of the blobs and the cause of the concurrent sickness. One of the earliest and most vividly remembered cases was that of Officer David Lacey himself. After encountering the blobs during his pre-dawn patrol on August 7th, Lacey initially felt fine, but within hours, he started to experience alarming symptoms. He described feeling nauseated, fatigued, and almost incapacitated by how sick he became. Lacey noted he was violently sick and had difficulty breathing properly. This illness set in so rapidly that he linked it to his exposure to the strange rain. Although Lacey recovered after a short period, a day or two by some accounts, the intensity of his symptoms made a deep impression. He was a robust man with no recent health issues. Yet that morning, he found himself weak and clammy, needing to rest. His quick onset of fatigue and stomach problems became one of the first anecdotes circulating about the blob's potential effects on health. Another prominent figure in the medical saga was Dottie Hearn, the elderly mother of Sonny Barcliffe. Dottie was in her early 60s and in reasonably good health when the blobs fell. After spending time around the property where the blobs lay, Dottie suddenly collapsed on August 7th, suffering from dizziness, nausea, and difficulty breathing. Sonny found her mother disoriented. Dottie was rushed to the hospital in nearby Montesano. There, doctors noted she had a severe inner ear infection and a raging bout of nausea, symptoms which could explain the dizziness she felt. She was hospitalized for 3 days while receiving treatment for dehydration and the ear infection. Dottie's physician, Dr. David Little, initially suspected her symptoms might simply be an inner ear problem, unrelated to the mysterious goo. Inner ear disturbances can indeed cause vertigo and sickness. However, given the unusual circumstances, Dr. Little agreed to investigate further. For Dottie and her family, the suspicion lingered that her sudden illness was triggered by contact with the blobs, especially when they learned that others nearby had also fallen ill at the same time. Throughout Oakville, numerous people reported coming down with what they described as flu or respiratory illness in the days immediately following the blob rain. Beverly Roberts, a 77-year-old resident, later recalled that everybody in the whole town came down with something like the flu, but notably, it was really hard flu that lasted 7 weeks, 2 or 3 months. While Beverly's statement might exaggerate for effect, a typical flu doesn't last that long, so perhaps she meant people had lingering symptoms or successive waves of illness. It underscores how widespread the malaise felt. Beverly herself became ill within a day of handling some blobs. Out of curiosity, she had picked a few up and even taken some home in a jar. She soon was struck by vertigo and felt generally unwell. Her condition deteriorated to the point that she spent nearly a week in the hospital recovering. Doctors noted she had severe vertigo and systemic infection, though the exact cause was not pinpointed. Beverly's case was one of the more severe among residents, and in retrospect, she was convinced the blobs were to blame. As she told later Unsolved Mysteries, I started feeling dizzy. I couldn't get my balance. I was cold, drenched in sweat. Weird stuff. The fact that such symptoms hit her so soon after exposure made a strong impression. Many other townspeople experienced milder but still notable ailments. Commonly reported symptoms included profound fatigue, fever, difficulty breathing, and upper respiratory tract issues like coughing and congestion. Some even had gastrointestinal upset, nausea, stomach cramps, and diarrhea, consistent with a viral flu. A few individuals had inner ear problems, similar to Dottie's, leading to balance issues and dizziness. At least one person had a severe ear infection that needed treatment, and several others described it as the worst flu of their lives. Importantly, most of these people recovered with time and standard medical care, rest, fluids, and no human fatalities were directly attributed to the illness. However, the duration and severity struck them as unusual for a summer flu. To this day, many Oakville residents firmly believe the blobs and the illnesses were connected, even though direct proof remains elusive. The local veterinarians and pet owners noticed animal illnesses and deaths around the same time, raising further alarms. On Sonny and Dottie's farm, for instance, a beloved kitten suddenly collapsed and died shortly after coming into contact with the goo on the ground. The kitten had been healthy, but was found with no obvious injuries, leading the family to suspect it ingested or licked some of the blobs on its fur or paws. Elsewhere, Beverly Roberts observed troubling signs among wildlife near her home. She reportedly found a dead frog and a dead raven in close proximity to where blob samples had been collected on her property. The frog and bird appeared to have died without external trauma. The raven, she noted, had some foam around its beak, which can be a sign of poisoning or severe stress in animals. Additionally, Beverly later told a local newspaper that about 12 animals belonging to her friends, including dogs and cats, died soon after the blob rain in 1994. These accounts included pets who might have eaten some of the blobs off the ground. One example was a family dog that went outside after a blob shower and later had trouble breathing and died at the vet the next day. While these stories are anecdotal, the pattern of multiple animals falling ill or expiring in the immediate aftermath was hard for residents to dismiss. The clusters of animal deaths made people even more wary. If the substance could kill a cat or bird, what could it do to humans with enough exposure? One more intriguing and somewhat further afield health anecdote comes from the same time frame, but outside Oakville. On the Washington coast, a couple named Jim and Kathy Bellinger encountered something curious. They reported that around August 1994, they came across numerous dead crabs along a beach, and near the carcasses was a clear gelatinous substance on the sand. When Kathy and her dog touched the goo, both became ill the following day with flu-like symptoms. This incident happening near the coast fueled speculation that whatever affected Oakville might have had a link to ocean life or events. For now, it's another piece of the medical puzzle, suggesting that the Oakville blob phenomenon might not have been isolated to humans, but part of a larger environmental anomaly impacting different species over a region. Throughout the mini crisis, local healthcare providers were on high alert. Clinics saw a spike in visits. Doctors like Dr. Little treated the symptoms as best they could, antivirals, antibiotics for secondary infections, or anti-vertigo medication, but they lacked any diagnostic tests to link illnesses to the blobs. The county health department did note the outbreak of a flu-like illness, but could not identify a specific pathogen at the time. In essence, they presumed it might be a coincidence, a summer flu outbreak that just happened to overlap with the blob rain. Still, many patients insisted they never had a flu like this before, and certainly not in August. One telling detail came from state microbiologist Mike McDowell, who worked at the Department of Health's lab. He later stated that the organisms found in the blobs could lead to severe illness. In an interview years later, he opined that the material was likely manufactured by someone for some purpose, and that, for some reason, Oakville was chosen as the test site, implying that the illnesses might have been an intended, or at least foreseen, effect of the blobs, if they were indeed a biological agent. McDowell's perspective was extreme and not officially endorsed, but it shows that even the scientists directly involved believed that the health effects were real and significant. By early autumn 1994, as the blobs stopped falling and people gradually recovered, the town began to regain its normal health profile. No long-term chronic illnesses have been conclusively linked to the incident, and people who were sick eventually got better. Dottie Hearn, for instance, recovered from her ear infection and lived several years more, though she sadly passed away in 1995. Her death was attributed to unrelated cause. She was elderly, and some sources indicated she had heart issues. The acute scare had passed, but the memories of that summer's sickness lingered. Oakville's residents would recall how the flu swept through right after the bizarre rain, and the association between the two events remained strong in local memory. In summary, the medical effects surrounding the Oakville Blobs were marked by a wave of acute illnesses in humans, intense but temporary flu-like and vertical symptoms, and a spate of animal deaths. While no causative agent was officially pinpointed at the time, the coincident timing left a deep impression that the blobs carried or fostered something harmful. This medical mystery added agency to the scientific lab analyses that were conducted on the blobs. People wanted to know what was in those blobs, if they could find bacteria, cells, toxins, anything. Perhaps it would explain why so many fell ill. We turn now to those laboratory investigations, which attempted to identify the composition of the Oakville blobs and yielded results as perplexing as the blobs themselves. Lab analyses. Faced with an unknown substance literally raining down on Oakville, and a flurry of illnesses possibly related to it, scientists and technicians from various labs undertook analyses of the mysterious blobs. The hope was that chemistry and microbiology could succeed where simple observations fell short, by determining what the blobs were made of and whether they carried any pathogens. Over the course of the investigation, several different laboratories, from a local hospital lab to state environmental and health labs, and even a private lab, examined samples of the goo. The findings, alas, were fragmentary and sometimes conflicting, deepening the mystery rather than conclusively solving it. The first known lab analysis occurred thanks to Dr. David Little, the physician who treated Dottie Hearn. While Dr. Little initially doubted the blobs had caused Dottie's illness, he agreed to pursue testing out of the due diligence. He took a sample of the gelatinous material, likely collected from Dottie's property by Sonny Barcliffe, and sent it to the lab at the hospital in Olympia, where Dottie had been treated. There, a hospital lab technician examined the sample under a microscope. The lab tech made a startling observation. Within the translucent jelly matrix, he believed he saw cells that appeared to have nuclei. In fact, he interpreted them as human white blood cells. White blood cells are a component of blood, and finding them in a rain blob was utterly unexpected. This preliminary result was communicated back to Dr. Little and the family. It looked as though the substance might be biological tissues of some kind, possibly even human in origin. One can imagine the shock this caused. Were the heavens literally raining blood? However, there was no red coloration to the blobs. They were clear, and no other blood components, like red cells, were noted. The hospital lab's finding of human white blood cells remains one of the most enigmatic data points in the Oakville case. If true, it implies the blobs contained cellular material from a vertebrate source, perhaps human or animal. Some have speculated that the sample might have been contaminated, or that the lab tech mistook some other cells for white blood cells. Nevertheless, this early report set a tone of deep perplexity. If the blobs contained white blood cells, what on earth were they, and how did such cells get into them? Meanwhile, samples had also been delivered to the Washington State Department of Ecology's lab, specifically their hazardous material unit. Mike Osweiler, a scientist at Ecology, led an analysis focusing on the physical and biological characteristics of the substance. The Department of Ecology's finding, reported in an Associated Press piece and mentioned in the New York Times, were that the blobs contained, quote, a number of cells of various sizes, unquote, and at least 2 types of bacteria. Importantly, Osweiler noted that none of the cells observed had a nucleus. This directly contradicted the hospital's lab's reported observation. If the cells in the blobs had no nuclei, they could not be human or animal cells. All mammal cells, except red blood cells, have nuclei. Cells without nuclei would likely be prokaryote, meaning bacteria or other simple organisms. Indeed, Osweiler's team could not identify the cells as belonging to any complex organisms. They seemed to be either some kind of amoeba or more likely debris of simple life form. The Ecology Lab's conclusion was that the substance was biological, organic, but not specifically identifiable, perhaps something like algae or bacteria aggregated in a gel. They did culture and identify 2 species of bacteria present, but at the time they did not publicly name them, simply noting they were common and likely harmless in environmental bacteria. Almost concurrently, the Washington State Department of Health's microbiology lab in Olympia tested another sample. Mike McDowell, a microbiologist there, later recounted his results in interviews and on television. McDowell's tests isolated 2 species of bacteria from the blobs. These were later identified: Pseudomonas fluorescens and Enterobacter cloacae. Both are bacteria that can be found in the environment, soil, or water, as well as in the human gut. Pseudomonas fluorescens is known for glowing under UV light and is usually not harmful to healthy individuals, though it can opportunistically infest those with weakened immune systems. Enterobacter cloacae is a bacterium commonly found in the digestive tract of humans and animals. Outside of its usual habitat, it can sometimes cause infection, such as urinary tract infections. McDowell was intrigued that these bacteria, which are commonly found in human or animal digestive systems, were present in the blobs. This raised the possibility that the blobs might be composed of or contaminated with some kind of biological waste or tissue where such bacteria thrive. However, it's worth noting that both bacteria are also widespread in soil and water, so their presence might not be extraordinary in a random environmental sample. McDowell's interpretation was that these organisms could lead to severe illness in people. This statement conflicts a bit with typical medical understanding. Normally, P. fluorescens and E. coli cause only mild infections, if any, and certainly not flu-like epidemics in healthy communities. It's likely he meant that under certain conditions, like inhalation, or if they were part of a biological agent, they might make people sick. His viewpoint was more alarmist. He suspected the blobs were not a natural occurrence at all, but a manufactured product, possibly loaded with microorganisms on purpose. McDowell even stated on one program that he believed Oakville may have been a test site for a biological agent, given that his superiors abruptly told him to stop asking about the samples once they vanished. We'll discuss that theory soon, but it's clear McDowell's own lab work left him deeply suspicious. He saw enough in the sample, unusual bacteria, and the very nature of the goo to convince him it wasn't just nature at play. One of the most puzzling twists in the lab story is what happened to the samples themselves. McDowell reported that before further more detailed studies could be done, the blob samples stored in the DOH lab mysteriously disappeared. One morning, he went to retrieve the samples from the lab refrigerator and found them missing. When he inquired with his manager about where they went, he was allegedly told, "Do not ask." That terse instruction strongly implies that someone higher up had removed the samples and did not want staff digging into it. Whether this was due to contamination concerns, a mundane clerical decision, or something more clandestine remains unknown. The disappearance of the samples has become a cornerstone of the Oakville Blob lore, often cited as evidence of a cover-up. Officially, there is no paper trail explaining it. The state lab years later had no record of ever receiving the blobs, which could either be an oversight or a deliberate expunging of data. To residents like Sonny Barclift and Beverly Roberts, hearing that the evidence simply vanished was beyond frustrating. It meant the chance of getting scientific answers had literally been thrown away. McDowell's ominous retelling only fueled suspicion that someone did not want the blobs examined further. Amid the confusion, journalist Tom Paulson took an extra step. With public agencies failing to provide clarity, Paulson decided to have a sample analyzed at his own expense. He obtained a chunk of the blobs, perhaps from a resident who had preserved one in alcohol or a similar medium, and sent it to a private laboratory for chemical analysis, paying around $100 out of pocket. The results that came back were intriguingly prosaic. The lab identified the substance as polyacrylamide. Polyacrylamide is a synthetic polymer, essentially a type of non-toxic gel-like plastic widely used in various industrial and scientific applications. It is used to prevent soil erosion as a soil stabilizer in agriculture, as a water treatment flocculant to help particles clump and settle out of water, for oil spills cleanup, and even to thicken products in cosmetics. In everyday terms, polyacrylamide is a kind of superabsorbent material that forms a gel when mixed with water, not unlike the material in certain kinds of hydrogel or those little beads that expand into gels when watered. This finding offered a completely different angle. It suggested the blobs might have been non-biological, but rather a man-made substance that somehow dispersed into the environment. Paulson's polyacrylamide discovery, if accurate, might explain why the Department of Ecology initially called the blobs inorganic. Polyacrylamide isn't alive, though it can certainly host bacteria. It's possible that the different test results were each capturing part of the truth. Maybe the blobs were a matrix of polyacrylamide gel in which environmental bacteria were present. However, even Paulson admitted that while this identification was plausible scientifically, it left a major question. How would polyacrylamide gel end up falling from the sky, especially repeatedly in one area? Polyacrylamide is not something that forms naturally in clouds. It would have to be released or spilled somehow. Nobody really wanted to accept that. That's a boring answer, Paulson said of his polyacrylamide results. Indeed, for townfolk who had been entertaining notions of biological warfare or extraterrestrial goo or pulverized jellyfish, the idea of a chemical polymer was anticlimactic, and it still didn't pinpoint a mechanism. To recap the analytical findings in simpler terms, here is what various tests revealed about the Oakville blob. Appearance and basic composition: clear, gelatinous, mostly water-based substance, tended to liquefy or evaporate after a short time, no strong odor, pH likely neutral, possibly a polymer matrix per private lab. Microscopic content: contains many cells of various sizes. Some tests suggest cells had nuclei, others found no nuclei. This discrepancy remains unresolved. The presence of cells indicate it was or had been part of a living organism or a culture of organisms, unless those cells were contaminants from the environment when it fell. Bacterial content: 2 species consistently reported: Pseudomonas fluorescens and Enterobacter cloacae. These are common gut and soil bacteria. No virulent pathogens like influenza virus or anything exotic were reported in the blobs. The bacteria alone wouldn't typically cause severe flu symptoms in an entire community. raising the question of whether a virus or toxin might have been present but undetected. Other biological content. The mention of white blood cells by one lab remains a curiosity. If true, it implies the blobs originated from some mammalian tissue or fluid, since white blood cells are found in blood, lymph, or bodily fluids. However, the ecology lab countered this by noting the cells lack nuclei, which rules out human white blood cells. One way to reconcile this is to consider that red blood cells from mammals have no nucleus, but the lab tech said white blood cells, which do have nuclei. So perhaps the hospital lab saw something resembling white cells, but possibly was mistaken. Chemical composition. Identified predominantly as polyacrylamide, a synthetic polymer that forms a gel. This doesn't exclude it containing biological components too. It could have been a gel laced with cells and bacteria. The overall outcome of the lab investigations was frustrating. Each result seemed to pose new questions. For example, if it was polyacrylamide, was it intentionally seeded in the clouds? And if so, by whom and why? If it contained digestive bacteria, did it come from some liquefied animal remains or sewage? If it had human cells, was it derived from a laboratory culture or medical waste? And why the heck would any of those things repeatedly fall on Oakville? With no intact samples remaining for future testing and inconsistent data from the tests that were done, the scientific inquiry hit a dead end by the mid-1990s. One footnote. In 2025, when a similar incident occurred in nearby Rochester, Washington, which we'll discuss later, people immediately thought to test new blobs. However, those 2025 blobs melted before comprehensive testing could be done. Still, based on the Oakville precedent, at least one report suggested the new blobs were likely also composed of polyacrylamide. This indicates that Paulson's boring answer of hydrogel might still be the best guess going forward. In summary, the lab analyses provided tantalizing clues, but ultimately no definitive explanation. We learned the blobs were real physical things, containing some biological elements and possibly man-made polymer, but the origin of material remained unidentified. With the evidence at hand, all investigators could do was propose hypotheses, which they did in abundance. Next, we will explore the many evolving theories that have been put forward to explain the Oakville Blobs, from soberly scientific to frankly fantastical. Evolving theories. Confronted with a mystery that official inquiries could not solve, people naturally began to fill the vacuum with theories. Over the years, numerous explanations for the Oakville Blobs have been proposed, debated, and dissected. These theories range from scientific hypotheses to speculative folklore to conspiracy-laden ideas. It's important to note that none of these theories have been conclusively proven. They are attempts to make sense of incomplete evidence. In this chapter, we'll review the major theories that have emerged, examining what evidence, if any, supports each and what challenges each faces. The narrative remains calm and factual, evaluating each idea on its merits without sensationalism. Some of the prominent theories include star jelly, a natural phenomenon. The blobs were a form of star jelly, a mysterious gelatinous substance known in folklore, perhaps naturally occurring on the ground after meteor showers or rains. Jellyfish explosion. The blobs were pieces of jellyfish, or marine organisms blasted into the atmosphere by military bombing runs over the ocean, later falling with the rain. Aircraft waste, blue ice. The blobs were human waste from airplane toilets that accidentally released at altitude, minus the usual chemical dye. Biological weapon or military experiment. The blobs were part of a biological warfare test or other secret military experiment, deliberately scattered over Oakville to gauge effects on a population. Synthetic polymer or industrial waste. The blobs were man-made hydrogel, like polyacrylate, from some industrial or agricultural source that got lifted into the air or misdropped in the area. Illegal dumping or other. Catch-all ideas like chemical dumping from a plane, a nearby industrial accident, or even extraterrestrial origin have been floated. No rain at all, localized growth. A contrarian view that perhaps the blobs didn't fall from the sky, but rather formed on the ground as a result of some earthly process, for example, slime mold or absorbent crystals swelling up after rain. Let's explore each of these along with their pros and cons. Star jelly hypothesis. One of the more romantic theories is that the Oakville Blobs were a manifestation of star jelly, a phenomenon reported in folklore for centuries. Star jelly, also known as astral jelly or witch's butter in various cultures, refers to a gelatinous substance found on grass or branches, often after meteor showers or heavy rains. Medieval texts describe star jelly as a translucent or grayish-white mucilage thought to fall from the stars. Over time, scientists and naturalists have suggested various explanations for star jelly. It might be the remains of frogs or toads, specifically frog spawn or frog reproductive organs, that have been eaten and regurgitated by predators like herons, or colonies of cyanobacteria that swell into clear jelly, or a type of slime mold or fungus that appears suddenly given the right conditions. In some cases, star jelly instances were determined to be sodium polyacrylate crystals that had absorbed water. This is a synthetic substance, similar to what's used in diapers or gardening soil additives. How does star jelly relate to Oakville? The idea is that perhaps the Oakville Blobs were not literally rain, but something that formed or arrived coincidentally during the rain. For example, some have posited that the blobs could have been frogs or fish eggs that a bird picked up and then dropped mid-flight. There is precedent for animal remains falling from the sky. Famously, in 1876, in Kentucky, chunks of meat seemed to rain down, later thought to be vomited meat from vultures overhead. There are also numerous accounts of frogs or fish raining after waterspouts lift them from ponds and drop them elsewhere. Could Oakville's gelatinous rain be something like that? For instance, one notion is that seagulls or eagles might have eaten masses of frog eggs or jelly-like amphibian body parts, and then disgorged them over Oakville, giving the appearance of a jelly rain. The star jelly theory also dovetails with the polymer finding. One scientific report noted that in 2012, in Bournemouth, England, transparent gelatinous blobs appeared after a storm, which turned out to be sodium polyacrylate, crystals that had absorbed rainwater. Those crystals may have come from a discarded package of water-retaining gel used in horticulture. Similarly, if Oakville's blobs were polyacrylate, a related polymer, it's conceivable that they were some kind of commercial absorbent material that got spread around, and when it rained, they swelled into jelly drops. One can imagine a scenario, perhaps a plane or a truck accidentally released a load of absorbent beads used, say, in agriculture to hold moisture in soil. Under dry conditions, they'd be invisible pellets, but once the rain hit, poof, thousands of jelly-like globs appeared. The Oakville blobs did tend to evaporate and vanish after a while, which is consistent with hydrated polymers that eventually dry out. Supporting this theory, star jelly and related phenomena have been observed worldwide and documented historically. Oakville could be a modern case. The timing with rain fits. Star jelly often is noticed after rain. Some star jelly cases involved material that was biologically innocuous but gel-like, similar to Oakville, where no lethal toxin was identified. The polymer explanation is real substance and matches lab results, and star jelly has indeed sometimes turned out to be synthetic hydrogel in recent cases. Challenges to this theory. Star jelly usually doesn't make people sick. It's usually inert or organic mush. Oakville's widespread illness is not typical for folklore star jelly reports. Star jelly is often localized to patches on the ground. Oakville's blobs were observed falling by some, implying descent from above, not just appearing on the ground, though one theory suggests maybe they only thought it fell. If it were amphibian remains, one might expect DNA evidence of frog or fish, which wasn't reported in the test. No frog DNA or fish cells were identified. However, no advanced DNA analysis was done then. The sheer volume and reoccurrence in Oakville would require a lot of raw material. For example, many frogs or a large amount of polymer. Natural star jelly events usually are one-offs or small in scale. In the end, the star jelly hypothesis remains possible, but doesn't account for everything. It could be part of the story, perhaps star jelly contributed, or the folklore simply parallels Oakville's. The BBC Science Focus analysis in 2021 leaned toward this type of explanation, that the blobs might not have rained down at all, but rather simply appeared on the ground overnight as a natural or mundane substance, and that illnesses were a coincidence. It pointed out that star jelly has been recorded since at least the 17th century and can come from various sources, including amphibians, algae, slime molds, or crystals. This viewpoint suggests the simplest interpretation. a natural phenomenon misinterpreted as rain. Yet, given the eyewitness accounts of falling blobs and the other evidence, many find this unsatisfying. Jellyfish bombing theory. One of the earliest and most popular theories around Oakville, especially locally, was what we call the exploding jellyfish, or jellyfish bombing theory. The gist of this idea is that the blobs were actually pieces of jellyfish from the ocean, shredded and carried into the sky by military bombing exercises, then dumped over Oakville with rainfall. This theory emerged when townfolk learned that the U.S. Air Force had been dropping live bombs into the Pacific in the weeks around the incident. The training area was off the coast of Washington, not extremely far from Oakville, as the crow flies, maybe on the order of 50 miles. People imagined a scenario where a large school of jellyfish, which is common in the Pacific waters, might have been near the surface when bombs detonated, causing countless jellyfish bits to be blasted upward. Perhaps updrafts or storm clouds then swept those gelatinous bits inland, where they mixed with rain clouds and eventually fell as gelatin rain. Supporting this theory was the superficial similarity. Jellyfish are gelatinous and mostly clear, and if pulverized, could conceivably rain down as tiny blobs. Additionally, Oakville's blobs were reported to contain organic matters in cells. Jellyfish are organic creatures. In fact, one local newspaper, the Palm Beach Post, wrote about this theory on August 21, 1994, quoting that townfolk were considering the possibility of jellyfish remains in the clouds. It was an idea that captured the imagination. It almost sounded like something from a whimsical science fiction plot. However, upon closer scrutiny, the jellyfish theory starts to unravel. First, the logistics are problematic. The bombing range was 10 to 20 miles off the coast, according to the initial reports, and the Air Force later clarified it was more like 40 to 50 miles away. For jellyfish debris to travel that distance, then fall fairly concentrated over a 20 square mile area is unlikely. One would need a very strong atmospheric event, such as a waterspout or powerful convective storm, to suck up the sea material and carry it that far. Meteorological records didn't indicate any such event at that time over Washington. Second, biological inconsistencies. Jellyfish cells are eukaryotic and have nuclei, but the Department of Ecology noted no nuclei in the blob cells, suggesting the material wasn't from a typical animal tissue, unless all that was left were, say, red blood cells of an animal or just bacteria from decomposition. Also, an analysis in Explorer's Web pointed out that Oakville Blobs allegedly contained cells without nuclei, which is inconsistent with the structure of jellyfish cells. This hints that scientists at the time had considered and discounted the jellyfish idea on those grounds. Third, if jellyfish were blown apart, one might expect other marine markers, salt content in the blobs, or tiny fragments of sand, shell, or plankton. There's no report that the blobs had a high salt content or any identifiable sea critter remains. It was noted they were not slimy or fishy smelling as one might expect from decaying jellyfish. Nevertheless, the image of raining jellyfish bits was too intriguing to fully die off. Some residents even half jokingly embraced it for tourism, like the aforementioned idea of a jellyfish festival. It also fit into a broader context of known animal rains. Indeed, the concept of marine life falling from the sky has some historical basis, as weird as that sounds. There have been documented cases of small fish or jellyfish allegedly raining down in storms in other parts of the world, often explained by waterspouts picking them up from the ocean. So one could argue Oakville's case might be a variant of that. To refute the jellyfish theory more definitively, the Air Force did confirm bombing practice but stressed it was far away and no evidence connected it to Oakville. The Oakville Blobs fell multiple times over weeks, not just once. Would that mean jellyfish were blasted skyward on 6 separate occasions? That stretches plausibility, unless we imagine the remains stayed in the atmosphere and fell gradually, which doesn't fit how things usually precipitate. Jellyfish are not known to float in the atmosphere for days. Once shredded, they'd likely disperse in the ocean or sink. The jellyfish theory, thus, while a colorful narrative, is generally regarded with skepticism by scientists. It's often brought up as a prime example of the kind of brainstorming the Oakville mystery inspired, but few consider it the leading explanation today. Aircraft waste theory. Another theory that was taken quite seriously initially was that the blobs might be some form of aircraft waste. Specifically, people wondered if it could be the waste from airplane toilets, known colloquially as blue ice. Normally, airliner lavatory waste is stored and disposed of on the ground, but there have been instances of leaks or releases at altitude, leading to frozen blue chunks falling to Earth. Could Oakville's blob be frozen sewage that thawed and broke apart into gelatinous bits as it descended? Dr. Little, Dottie Hearn's physician, was one proponent of this possibility. He theorized that the blobs were discharged waste from an airliner, which might explain the presence of human white blood cells. If the waste contained blood or a lot of human organic matter, and also the sickness, since lavatory waste could carry bacteria and even antifreeze or disinfectant additives. Modern airplane lavatory systems do use a blue chemical, often a deodorizer antifreeze called Anotech or similar, to break down waste, which would be toxic if ingested by animals, possibly explaining pet deaths. Dr. Little thought that if the blue chemical wasn't present or had somehow dissipated, you could get clear blobs remaining that contained human waste traces, which could indeed make people ill through microbial infection or chemical exposure. When the FAA was contacted, however, they shot down this idea. The FAA spokesperson pointed out that the chemicals used in airline lavatories are dyed blue and would unmistakably tint any fallen waste blue or blue-green. The Oakville material was clear white. Additionally, it would be a remarkable coincidence for multiple aircrafts to drop waste over the same small town repeatedly in a short span, which would have to involve serious negligence, or deliberate action, both of which would presumably leave records or be noticed by regulators. Also, any large chunks falling from cruising altitude would likely have been semi-frozen and might have caused impact damage or at least been noticed as chunks, not rice-sized droplets. There's also the quantity issue. Blue ice incidents usually involved a single clump falling, not a widespread dispersal over miles. Oakville's blobs fell like a rain over a broad area, which doesn't match how an isolated leak from a plane behaves. In the realm of aircraft-related ideas, some have speculated about military aircraft rather than commercial airliners. The notion here is maybe a military plane could have dumped some experimental substance. This overlaps with the military experiment theory, but if we stick strictly to aircraft waste, the main waste would be fuel dumps or lavatory dumps. Jet fuel dumping done to reduce weight for emergency landings would result in a fine mist of kerosene that evaporates, not gelatin, so that's out. Thus, while the aircraft waste theory was logical to check, since history had examples of weird stuff falling from planes, it doesn't align well with the observed characteristics of the Oakville Blobs or the pattern of events. The FAA statement that their chemicals would turn any waste blue remains a key rebuttal. So unless we assume a scenario of a plane dumping something unusual, like say a cargo of experimental gel, the straightforward toilet waste explanation seems unlikely. Military experiment theory. From early on, a segment of Oakville residents, and later many observers, have harbored suspicions that the blobs were not a natural phenomenon at all, but rather the product of a deliberate human action, specifically a military or government experiment. Given the 1990s context of heightened awareness of military testing, the Gulf War had recently seen the use of experimental agents, and historical revelations about things like the Tuskegee syphilis study or Cold War-era biological simulations over U.S. cities were public knowledge. It wasn't too far-fetched for people to consider that some classified experiment might have been conducted over a remote town like Oakville. Mike McDowell, the state microbiologist, became a prominent voice for this theory. As we've noted, McDowell in a later interview bluntly said, "This material was manufactured by someone for some purpose, and for some reason, Oakville was chosen as the test site." He stopped short of naming the U.S. military, but the implication was clear in the context. Who else has the capability to drop mysterious biological substances from the sky in a covert manner? The suggestion is that the blobs could have been a matrix for delivering bacteria or other agents to test how a civilian population would react. Perhaps Oakville, being small and relatively isolated, was seen as a contained petri dish. The illnesses that followed could be evidence of a biological agent at work, maybe not intended to kill since no human died, but to incapacitate. The disappearance of samples and the "do not ask" directive to McDowell fit this narrative. It was covered up once things went out of hand or once curiosity got too high. Supporting circumstantial evidence. The military presence in the region. Washington State has several military bases. For example, Joint Base Lewis McChord not far away, naval bases and more. It wouldn't be inconceivable for aircraft from these bases to be involved in exercises or tests over the Pacific or even over land. There were indeed known instances of the U.S. military conducting biological or chemical dispersion tests on unwitting populations in the mid-20th century. For example, the 1950 spraying of San Francisco with a benign bacterium to stimulate germ warfare, or the 1966 testing in New York City subways. This set a precedent that the idea wasn't purely paranoid fantasy. Some residents claimed to see unmarked black helicopters or unusual aircraft during the period, though these accounts are anecdotal and not universally reported. This is a common motif in conspiracy theories, but does show up in some retellings of Oakville. The fact that multiple falls occurred could indicate multiple releases, which fits in experimental design more than a one-time accident would. If one looks at the identified bacteria, Enterobacter cloacae has at times been studied for its potential as a simulant organism. In some biowarfare tests, relatively harmless bacteria are used to stimulate more dangerous ones to test dispersion without harming people severely. One historical example, Serratia marcescens, was used in the 1950 San Francisco test, causing some hospital infection inadvertently. E. cloacae and P. fluorescens might analogously have been chosen as relatively safe but noticeable agents. Challenges and counterpoints. There's no direct evidence. For example, a declassified document or whistleblower linking any military project to Oakville. All is speculative. If it were a test, it clearly made people sick and even killed animals. That would be a serious ethical breach and risky in terms of secrecy. People were hospitalized after all. While not impossible, it would be rather sloppy test if the goal was secrecy. Why use the gelatinous matrix? If the idea was to test dispersal of biological agent, they could spray an aerosol or drop powder. The blob seems like an inefficient method to spread bacteria. They mostly fell to the ground without necessarily being inhaled by people, unless aerosolized on impact. However, one could argue the gel was to ensure the agent survived the fall and stuck around. The region, Pacific Northwest, is damp and often overcast, not ideal for some tests which prefer stable weather. Unless the blobs themselves were the experiment, testing dispersal of a gel substance. If Oakville was chosen, why? It had no strategic importance, possibly because it was ordinary and isolated enough to not draw big attention, a typical small American town. This theory remains a favorite among those who lean toward conspiratorial explanations, and it cannot be entirely ruled out based on available information. It does, however, assume malevolent intent without hard proof. Many Oakville residents, including the likes of Beverly Roberts and Sonny Barcliffe, did feel in their gut that something secretive had happened. the story of men in suits asking questions, and the vanished sample feeds this feeling. If one is inclined to distrust official narratives, the Oakville Blobs incident has all the ingredients of a cover-up story. From a narrative standpoint, it certainly fits that the truth remains hidden because it was an experiment. But in absence of smoking gun evidence, this theory lives on mainly in the realm of speculation and occasional TV mystery shows. No government agency has ever acknowledged anything of the sort, and Freedom of Information Act requests, as far as is known, has not unearthed relevant documents. Synthetic polymer, industrial origin theory. The polyacrylamide finding by Tom Paulson's commission test gave rise to a more down-to-earth theory that the blobs were essentially a kind of industrial or agricultural hydrogel that accidentally ended up overhead. Polyacrylamide and its cousins, like sodium polyacrylate, are used widely. Let's explore possible ways such a polymer could have gotten into the environment in blob form. One idea is related to cloud seeding or weather modification. Polyacrylamide is not typically used in cloud seeding, which usually employs silver iodide or dry ice. But there have been experiments using various gel particles to encourage rain. It's a long shot, but perhaps some experiment involved dispersing a water-absorbing polymer into clouds to induce rainfall. If so, when the polymer absorbed moisture, it would form jelly droplets and fall out. There were indeed programs in the mid-20th century, like Project Skywater, looking at precipitation enhancement, but none publicly known to involve gels. Still, a rogue agent or a private enterprise could be imagined. A more straightforward possibility: crop dusting or firefighting operations. Sometimes compounds, including gels, are released from planes for firefighting, fire retardant gels, or dusted on crops for various reasons. If a plane accidentally dumped a load of hydrogel used, say, to keep firefighting chemicals stuck to foliage at high altitude, it could fall over an unintended area. However, Oakville's incidents happened during rain, not fires. Another angle: industrial accident. Polyacrylamide is used in water treatment plants. Could a water treatment facility's output somehow aerosolize or evaporate and then come down as rain? Unlikely, as they usually don't release stuff to open air. Or perhaps a nearby factory vented something that coalesced in the atmosphere. We should also consider illegal dumping. ExplorerWeb mentions one theory of illegal chemical dumping. If a chemical company or drug manufacturer had a batch of gel waste, maybe someone tried to incinerate it or jettison it from a plane or truck to avoid regulations, scattering it in the environment. The advantages of a synthetic origin theory. Lab evidence points to polyacrylamide, which matches a synthetic polymer. It explains why the blobs could be largely inert chemically, but still harbor common bacteria. Bacteria could have just contaminated the gel, either in storage or after falling. No exotic mechanism is needed. It could be a mundane accident or environmental mishap. Polyacrylamide would also explain the lack of nuclei. It's not alive, and could also trap some cells or debris within it. The problems. How to account for multiple times falls. An industrial accident typically is a one-time event, unless someone was repeatedly dumping something on purpose, which circles back to a deliberate act, though not necessarily military. Polyacrylamide is usually in powder or crystal form until mixed with water. Why would it be in blobs already? Perhaps it encountered water at high altitude, like in clouds. But that brings us back to needing a dispersal mechanism in the sky. If polyacrylamide is used for erosion control, for example, sprayed on soil, could a windstorm pick it up? It generally sticks to soil and doesn't just fly away on its own. One interesting supporting anecdote, as noted in the Science Focus Q&A in Bournemouth, UK 2012, after a heavy hailstorm, residents found clear jelly pellets in gardens, which scientists identified as sodium polyacrylate from likely some agricultural source. The theory was that perhaps the crystals were lifted by strong winds from a nearby field or greenhouse, absorbed rain, and fell as gel blobs. That is a documented modern case very similar in description to Oakville, minus the illnesses. If it happened there, it could happen in Washington. Thus, the polymer origin theory remains one of the more plausible non-sensational explanations for the Oakville's blob. It doesn't capture the imagination like aliens or secret weapons, but it has a ring of pragmatic mystery, a weird chain of events causing an unintended consequence with a fairly ordinary substance. Unfortunately, as with all theories, it leaves the detail of how exactly did it get up there unanswered. Other notable theories and ideas. Beyond the main theory above, a few other notions have been floated. Extraterrestrial origin. Some people have jokingly suggested the blobs might be of extraterrestrial origin, like some kind of space jelly that fell from a passing comet or UFO. This idea was never taken very seriously by investigators, especially given the earthly bacteria found in the blobs. It's more in the realm of science fiction and urban legend. However, in pop culture, you'll see references to The Blob, a 1958 horror film about an alien blob, when Oakville is discussed. There is no evidence for aliens here beyond the overall weirdness of the event. Meteor shower residue. A variant of star jelly, but a more cosmic twist. Perhaps the blobs were a substance that fell during the Perseid meteor shower, which occurs in August. Medieval people believed star jelly came from meteors, but meteor material is rocky and metallic, not gelatinous. The coincidence of timing, August, is the only link. And modern science finds no connection between meteors and jelly. Slime mold bloom. Some biologists thought maybe a slime mold or cyanobacteria bloom occurred. Under certain conditions, colonies of microbes can aggregate into a jelly-like mass, but these usually attach to soil or tree bark. They don't rain down. If Oakville's ground already had something like nostoc, a cyanobacteria that forms jelly, heavy rain could hydrate it and make it appear suddenly. Conceivably, some residents might have confused such ground-growing jelly for fallen from sky jelly, but given the consistency of accounts and how widespread it was, this seems unlikely as a sole explanation. Combination of factors. It's possible the truth is not one theory, but several factors coinciding. For instance, maybe a military flare or chafe exercise, which sometimes uses polymer, coincided with natural star jelly presence and a flu outbreak. This would muddy the waters, each piece contributing some evidence, making it look like one big event, when in fact multiple things happen together. While this might sound contrived, nature and human activity do sometimes produce coincidences. After all the speculations, the Oakville Blobs remain officially unsolved. As Paulson Riley noted, people tended to reject the boring explanation, polymer, because they wanted it to be something exotic, like biological warfare or jelly bits. The lack of closure means each theory lives on in some corner of public discourse. The most credulous explanation, as one Gizmodo article put it, is that the blobs were essentially star jelly, perhaps some mundane slime that got correlated with an illness outbreak by coincidence. The most conspiratorial explanation is that it was a deliberate test of a man-made agent, and in between lie the jellyfish and polymer accidents, each with some evidence but also holes. What virtually everyone agree on is that no preserved blob samples exist today for modern analysis. Had even a small vial survived in a freezer, modern DNA sequencing or chemical analysis could potentially solve it in hours. But we are left only with secondhand reports and the fading memories of tests from 1994. This forces the story of the Oakville Blobs to remain in the realm of theory and conjecture. Having sifted through the theories, we now turn to what has happened in the decades since 1994, how Oakville and the wider world have remembered or forgotten the blobs, and notably, the news of a later incident in 2025 that brought the mystery back into focus. These long-term impacts in epilogues form the next part of our narrative. Later incidents and long-term impact. For many years, the Oakville Blobs incident remained a singular event, relegated to books of curiosities, paranormal TV shows, and the personal recollections of those who lived through it. It became a kind of local legend, one that townsfolk would recount to newcomers or journalists with a mix of pride and lingering puzzlement. As time passed, it seemed the blobs were a once-in-a-lifetime oddity. Oakville never saw another gelatinous rain in the years immediately following 1994. The town went back to its normal rhythms, logging trucks rumbling through, rain falling as plain old rain, the biggest news being school events or the annual rodeo. Yet the fascination with the Oakville Blobs did not fully die out. Every so often, an article or TV program would revive the story, each time introducing it to new audiences. In the late 1990s, as noted, unsolved mysteries gave it national exposure. In the 2000s and 2010s, the incident got mentions on internet forums, in mystery documentaries, and on websites like Historic Mysteries and Mental Floss, which recounted the tale to curious readers. It gained a kind of cult status among enthusiasts of the unexplained, often cited alongside phenomena like the Kentucky meat shower of 1876 or rains of frogs as a modern example of weird things falling from the sky. For Oakville residents, the legacy was a bit mixed. On one hand, it put their little town on the map, albeit for something very strange. As journalist Tom Paulson humorously observed, the blobs of Oakville are probably the most long-lived, most re-reported story of mine. That's my legacy. People from the outside would occasionally drive through Oakville just to see the place where it rained blobs. The town never did end up hosting a Jellyfish festival or selling blob burgers at the diner. Those were ideas mooted in the initial excitement and largely forgotten when the media frenzy passed. Oakville is a humble place, and day-to-day life doesn't revolve around its moment of fame. However, locals like Beverly Roberts or Sonny Barcliffe would still get a phone call now and then from a reporter asking them to recount what they remembered around each anniversary, which they graciously did to keep the story alive. The 30th anniversary of the event in August 2024 saw a flurry of retrospectives. Local news radio station KXRO ran a segment 30 years later, the Oakville Blob, which was actually an update of a 20th anniversary piece. It recapped the unsolved mystery story and noted that neither Mike McDowell or Officer Lacey, both by then retired, were readily available to comment further. It ended whimsically, hoping perhaps Oakville or another town might see this blob again someday. Little did anyone know that wish or warning was about to come true. The Rochester reoccurrence. In the spring of 2025, nearly 31 years after the original Oakville Blob incident, a nearby community experienced a strikingly similar event. On April 8, 2025, Rochester, Washington, a small unincorporated area about 8 miles east of Oakville, had its own encounter with gelatinous raindrops. It was as if the Oakville Blobs had returned, not exactly to the same town, but to the same region. A subtle reminder that the mystery was not entirely closed. The key witness in 2025 was Allie McCrite, a Rochester resident who had actually once lived in Oakville and thus was familiar with the old legend. Allie was coming home from work in the late afternoon, around 4 p.m., when she noticed something unusual falling in her yard. At first, she thought it was a heavy rain or maybe hail, because she could see little impacts on the ground. But as she looked closer, she realized these were clear blobs, gelatinous and glistening in the light. They were considerably larger than the 1994 blobs. She described them as about the size of the palm of her hand. They were translucent, with a consistency a bit firmer than jello, but still jelly-like. There was no smell except a clean rain smell and no color. She and her family observed roughly 10 blobs scattered around the yard, on the grass, and even one on a piece of outdoor furniture. Knowing the history, Allie was amazed. We noticed clear blobs falling from the sky and landing in our yard, she later told a local newspaper. Her first thought was, the Oakville Blobs are back. This immediate mental link shows how ingrained the 1994 story was in local culture memory. A generation later, people still recognized the pattern. Neighbors in Rochester also reportedly saw the blobs that day, confirming it wasn't an isolated incident on her property. The blobs seemed to have fallen over a localized area, perhaps a few properties, but not widespread over miles, at least based on reports. It may simply be that not many people were outside at that moment to notice. Allie carefully collected a couple of the blobs in a jar to preserve them. She wanted to have them analyzed if possible, given the historical importance. However, much like in 1994, the substance proved unstable. By the next day, the blobs in the jar had melted into a watery fluid at room temperature. The structure broke down, leaving only a residue. This meant that by the time she connected with news or scientists, the physical sample was largely gone, except perhaps some liquid. The story made quick rounds in local media. The Centralia Chronicle, the local newspaper, ran a piece titled, "Oakville Blob Return. Residents say she and neighbors saw mysterious blobs falling from the sky once again." This article included photos that Allie provided of the blobs, likely showing translucent globs on the grass. It verified that this was not an April Fool's prank or misremembered tale. News evidence had been documented. Around the same time, the Seattle public radio station KUOW featured Allie McCrite's account on their Soundside program, noting the uncanny return of the phenomenon in almost the same place after 31 years. Because Allie had lived in Oakville, she immediately contextualized it. "I used to live in Oakville, so obviously I knew about the Oakville Blob, because everyone does." I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is literally what happened." Her tone was one of excitement and astonishment rather than fear. One reassuring difference in 2025. Nobody reported falling ill after the Rochester blobs fell. Allie and her household did not experience any vertigo or flu-like symptoms. Neighbors who also touched or handled the blobs with some caution likewise didn't note any sickness. Additionally, there were no reports of pets or animals suffering ill effects. It appears that this time the blob, while bizarre, were benign to health, at least as far as anyone could tell in the short term. This raised some interesting possibilities. Maybe the 2025 blobs were chemically or biologically different. For example, perhaps only polymer with no bacteria. Or maybe, in 1994, the illnesses truly were coincidental or due to a virus going around, but not the blobs themselves. Without lab tests on the 2025 material, it's hard to know, but the absence of sickness was notable. The Rochester incident reignited interest in solving the blob mystery once and for all. There was now a fresh story, fresh media coverage, and presumably more modern analytic tools at the ready. However, given that the blobs melted and the event was fleeting, it doesn't seem that any definitive new analysis emerged publicly. One might wonder if any government agency quietly investigated the 2025 blobs, but if so, nothing has been announced. For the community, the 2025 reoccurrence brought a mix of feelings. Some Oakville residents felt vindicated. See, it wasn't a one-time fluke or hallucination. It happened again. It adds credibility that something real is at play in the environment. Others felt a bit uneasy. Could it happen regularly now? Twice in 31 years isn't exactly regular, but it breaks the notion that it was a singular event. Perhaps most of all, there was a sense of renewed curiosity in conversation. People started buzzing about theories again, exchanging the old stories, and even enjoying the spotlight. As Allie McCride said, she appreciated how the mystery sparked interesting conversations and even a sense of fun speculation in the community. She was genuinely curious about the cause, but also noted, at the same time, if it's a mystery, it's more fun. Then people can speculate. This captures the truth about such unexplained phenomena. They become part entertainment, part enigma. The not knowing allows for endless discussion. Following the Rochester event, one might have expected perhaps some follow-up or organized investigation. It's possible that if more blobs had fallen, or if someone had preserved a sample in a lab, we would have heard. As of late 2025, however, the trail is quiet. Rochester's blob remains as unexplained as Oakville's. The Oakville Blobs incident has embedded itself modestly in popular culture and the collective consciousness of Pacific Northwest folklore. It's not as famous as, say, Roswell or Bigfoot, but within the region and among mystery aficionados, it's well known. Aside from unsolved mysteries, there was an episode of a show called Monsters and Mysteries in America that covered Oakville. In 2023, a new series on Netflix titled Files of the Unexplained devoted an episode to the Oakville case, Episode 7, Bizarre Blobs of Washington. This brought the story to a global streaming audience, complete with dramatizations and interviews with locals. Sonny Barcliffe appears to have been interviewed per episode description. The persistent presence of Oakville in media attests to its enduring allure. It's a story with the perfect mix of elements: an everyday small town, an inexplicable natural event, a dash of danger, with people getting sick but not dying, conflicting scientific results, and no closure. It's the kind of mystery that can be spun in an airy or lighthearted way depending on the narrator. Online, Oakville's blob have been discussed on Reddit forums where amateur sleuths share links to news archives and speculate on everything from government testing to unusual algae bloom. It has also found its way into lists of top 10 weird weather events on blogs and Science Site. For example, Mental Floss in Discovery UK Both published articles summarizing the case, ensuring that the story is passed on to new readers in the 2020s. Locally, Oakville itself doesn't capitalize on the blobs in any commercial way. There's no blob museum or annual celebration, but it remains a point of local identity. The city's official website and literature focus more on its logging history and community aspects. The blobs are almost too bizarre to be part of the city's formal narrative. But in person, residents don't shy away from talking about it if asked. It's become part of the oral history of the area. Long-term impact on science. The Oakville Blobs case is occasionally cited in discussions about the importance of preserving samples and data in investigations. Scientists have lamented that such an intriguing case couldn't be fully resolved because samples were lost and testing was limited. It's a cautionary tale. When the weird happens, collect and store some evidence properly. Perhaps if a third occurrence ever happens, there will be better preparedness to analyze it with today's tech. DNA sequencing, mass spectrometer can do wonders with even tiny amounts of material. In a broader sense, the Oakville Blobs feed into the appreciation that even in the modern era, our world can present mysteries that defy immediate explanation. We like to think we have a handle on all natural phenomena, but odd rainfalls remind us that classification and understanding are sometimes playing catch-up with nature or human oddities. The story also highlights community resilience in narrative building. Oakville's residents underwent a real, tangible, strange event and got through it, then kept that story alive through telling and retelling. They have demonstrated how a community can embrace a mystery, not with panic, but with curiosity, humor, and a desire for answers. As of now, the Oakville Blobs remain officially unsolved, with two known instances, 1994 and 2025, in the same corner of Washington state. Each retelling, each new investigation or recurrence adds layers to the narrative, but still leaves the core question open. What were the blobs, and why did they fall from the sky? In our final section, we will reflect on this question and the nature of such mysteries, acknowledging that we know what we don't and what Oakville Blob means in the grand scheme of things. Reflections. The tale of the Oakville Blobs is a reminder that our world still holds secrets and surprises, even in an age of satellites and scientific rigor. As we conclude this detailed journey through the events, evidence, and theories, it's worth pausing to reflect on a few key themes that emerge from the story: the interplay of fact and folklore, the response of a community to the unknown, and the humbling reality of unanswered questions. Fact versus folklore. At first glance, the Oakville Blob could sound like pure folklore. Mysterious goo falls from sky making people ill. Has the cadence of an urban legend. Indeed, over 30 years the story has taken on aspects of legend. Details slightly embellished here, quotes remembered a bit differently there, and interpretations branching out in multiple directions. Yet, underpinning it all are the documented facts, multiple credible witnesses, hospital records of illness, actual lab reports, and even a recent recurrence with photographic evidence. Oakville's blob occupied that liminal space where fact and folklore meet, a real event that has been mythologized due to our lack of complete understanding. This is a pattern seen often in human history. The star jelly of medieval lore was not purely imaginary. People did find glue after meteor showers, and we still don't always know what it was. As our knowledge expands, we often find prosaic explanations for yesterday's mysteries. It's possible that one day a future scientist or a lucky analyst will show that Oakville's blobs were something relatively ordinary in origin, perhaps a kind of algae bloom or polymer, thus moving it from mystery into the annals of explained phenomena. But until then, it straddles the boundary, teaching us how folklore can form around a core of reality and how important it is to keep an open yet critical mind. Community and resilience. One striking aspect of the Oakville incident is the community's composed response. By all accounts, there was no mass hysteria or chaos in Oakville during those weeks. People certainly were concerned, especially as more fell ill, but they banded together, took practical steps, collecting samples, contacting authorities, and looked after one another. There's something gentle about how Oakville handled its bizarre reign. Even the humor, the Jellyfish festival idea, reflects a choice to confront the unknown with a bit of light-hearted resilience rather than fear. In an era where unknown substances might trigger immediate assumptions of terrorism or widespread panic, Oakville's 1994 experience was relatively calm and intimate. Neighbors talked it out. A local police officer and a daughter of an affected woman became key investigators alongside professionals. Perhaps the mid-90s were a slightly more innocent time, or perhaps the small-town ethos of Oakville played a role, likely both. This incident became part of their local identity, and they've carried it forward with a sense of intrigue and pride rather than trauma. That said, for those who fell gravely ill or lost pets, it was surely frightening and painful in the moment. The community's support and the fact that the illnesses eventually resolved helped heal any rifts the mystery might have caused. The limits of knowledge. From a scientific perspective, the Oakville Blobs are humbling. They show that not every question finds an immediate answer, even when approached with the tools of science. Part of the issue was the small scale. Only a handful of samples, quickly lost. In part was the time, 1994, when certain advanced analyses weren't readily available. But even with the data we had, multiple interpretations were possible. In science, we ideally repeat experiments to nail down the truth. But here, nature did not oblige with easy repeatability, at least not until 2025. many decades later. This is a classic problem of investigating rare anomalies. One can gather clues, but proving a hypothesis may be extremely challenging without the ability to reproduce or further examine the phenomenon. And so the Oakville Blobs remain a kind of open case file. The Washington State Department of Health and Department of Ecology likely considered it dormant. They moved on to more pressing public health matters long ago. No academic journals published a paper on the blobs, precisely because the evidence wasn't solid enough for a peer-reviewed analysis. The baton for keeping the inquiry alive has been passed to independent writers, local historians, and the occasional curious scientist or journalist. In reflecting on what might have been, one cannot help but imagine alternate scenarios. If only a sample had been preserved in the sterile container, and archived perhaps by now, genome sequencing could tell us if any unusual microbes were present, or chemical analysis could confirm the polymer composition firmly. If only the event had happened in the age of smartphones, we might have countless videos of the blob falling, providing clues about their origin. Instead, we have just a few photos and witness descriptions. And yet, perhaps there is a value in the mystery itself. As Ally McCride mused, the mystery is fun and sparks speculation. That doesn't mean one wouldn't prefer a definitive answer, but human beings have always been enthralled by the unexplained. In a way, the Oakville Blobs have become a modern parable, a prompt to exercise imagination, critical thinking, and investigative curiosity. Classrooms have used it as case studies in critical analysis. Students discuss what could be the cause, propose experiments, debate reliability of sources. Thus, the Blobs incident, unsolved as it is, has an educational legacy too. Possibility for the future. It is not impossible that we will get more information someday. The 2025 Rochester Blobs give hope that if the phenomenon recur at random intervals, maybe next time the condition will allow better study. Perhaps a laboratory or university in Washington will take interest and set up a protocol. For instance, instructing locals to refrigerate any future samples immediately and deliver them for analysis. We now have environmental DNA, eDNA, techniques that could detect minute traces of biological origin. If a next time occurs, the mystery could be cracked with 21st century science. If no further events occur, then Oakville's mystery may remain one of these enduring unanswered questions. And maybe that's okay. Not every strange occurrence in history has been solved. Some fade into obscurity, others remain legendary. The Oakville Blobs might settle into a niche akin to that of the Taos Hum or the Marphilites. Regional mysteries that never fully succumb to explanation. In reflecting on the entire saga, one is reminded of a simple truth, often quoted in such context. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found the cause doesn't mean there isn't one. We just didn't capture it. Conversely, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so far, while many extraordinary theories have been offered, none have the smoking gun evidence to elevate them above doubt. The balance between wonder and skepticism is delicate here, and the Oakville story invites us to walk that line. Finally, on a human level, the Oakville Blobs story is about ordinary people encountering the extraordinary and responding with both curiosity and care. It's about a mother and daughter taking samples to the lab in hope of protecting their family. It's about a police officer doing his duty and finding something he never expected on his windshield. It's about a journalist thinking he's on a fluff piece and then literally having the mystery rain down in front of him. And it's about residents like Beverly, who years later can still vividly recall those 7 weeks of strange flu and persist in asking, what was that stuff? In closing, the Oakville Blobs remain a gentle enigma, a soothing narrative in the sense that it did not result in catastrophe, yet an unsettling one in that it defies full understanding. Perhaps the blobs will eventually be consigned to a footnote of a meteorological or military history, or perhaps they'll live on as a campfire story for generations to come. Until we know for sure, the sky over Oakville on that August morning will continue to hold its secret, silently challenging us to keep looking up and wondering at the things that sometimes fall from above.